Today we have the chance to stand up and say that a country's behavior is no longer acceptable. We have the opportunity to make a decision that's not easy but right and carries with it great moral weight. It is because of these chances and these opportunities today that I call upon our country to boycott the Beijing Olympics. I will do it with this model. We will not be sending any heads of state or any of our state officials to any of the games or the ceremonies. And then if people from the American public choose to go to the games, we will be confiscating any memorabilia from those games when they return into the country, because we are that serious about boycotting these games, and we feel it's very important. Today what I'm going to do is I'm going to convince you that we need to boycott the games with 2 points. The first being that we have a moral imperative to act, and then second, a discussion about whether or not boycotts work. So let's get into the idea about whether or not we have a moral imperative to act. And I feel our moral imperative to act falls under a couple of categories. It's a discussion of Taiwan, it's a discussion of Tibet, it's a discussion of Darfur, and it's a discussion of the way they treat the very people that live in their own country. So let's talk about Tibet first and foremost. So the official occupation of Tibet by China began in 1951, and I would be the first person to say that originally when China did start occupying Tibet, they probably did have nothing but good intentions, and one of the results that happened was the abolishment of serfdom. However, as the evolution of the relationship between China and Tibet has been going, it's not been incredibly beneficial for the Tibetan people. They have essentially exiled the Dalai Lama, they have put a major crackdown on their religious practices, and on top of all these different things, they flooded the region with Han Chinese, and what that's doing is it's diluting this very special and unique culture and religion, and that's absolutely unacceptable. If you can turn to the recent events in the news when the Tibetan people turned out simply to protest and demand a free Tibet, to have the right to say that they believe in a free Tibet, there was a bloody crackdown by the Chinese officials on the Tibetan people. According to NPR, the people who were actually arrested for these protests received 17 years to life in prison, which is absolutely unacceptable. The things that the Chinese government is doing to the Tibetan people that are deliberately hateful and are just hateful policies are no longer acceptable, and we cannot stand for them. The second issue that we have to talk about is Taiwan's relationship with China. Now, both the Taiwanese people and their government feel that they should be able to be free of China, to have autonomy from China. And China, at the mere suggestion of this freedom, responds with violence and intimidation. China regularly exercises shows of strength to intimidate the Taiwan people, and we do not find this to be acceptable, and we will no longer put up with it. The third reason, and the one that is most dear to my heart, is the issue of Darfur. Since the conflict started in 2003, it's estimated that 400,000 people have died because of the genocide that's occurring in the region today. Now, the history behind this conflict is essentially that the Janjaweed, which are an Arab militia, have decided, and they do have government backing, that they will be committing genocide against ethnic Africans. Now, this wouldn't be a problem except for the fact that China is heavily involved in the genocide in Darfur. And you might wonder how. Well, how is China even involved? And the great thing about this is that China is Sudan's greatest trading partner. They are heavily economically intertwined with Sudan. And on top of that, they also sell them all those weapons. And this wouldn't be a bad thing if the weapons weren't used the minute that they get them to slaughter innocent civilians. And because I don't find it acceptable for China to be dealing weapons to a region that's having genocide and then using those weapons on innocent women and children being gunned down and having their villages burned, I would urge you to think about this issue and to think more closely about the relationship that China has with Darfur. On top of that, whenever the issue of genocide in Darfur comes up in the United Nations, China has the face of apathy. According to the United Nations, on a recent vote on UN Resolution 1706, which would increase the number of peacekeepers in the region, China decided to abstain. This abstention represents apathy. It represents a non-caring and a non-committance to solving the problems that are happening in Darfur, and that is simply unacceptable. And then the fourth point is the disregard for human rights in their own country. The funny thing is that in preparing for the Olympics, China knew that they had to evict a lot of people from their housing. According to the Center on Housing Rights and Evictions, 1.5 million people have been evicted from the places that they live. Anyone who protested was arrested. The problem with this is that China has not chosen to relocate barely any of the people that they've evicted. Also, according to the Center on Housing Rights and Evictions, only 15,000 of those who have lost their homes have been relocated to a new housing unit, and that is unacceptable at best. The other problem that I have is the way that they deal with the poor and the handicapped. They've passed laws that don't allow beggars to be in the city during the Olympic Games and don't allow the mentally retarded or people with disabilities to be there either. These simply encourage us to act based upon a moral imperative. So now let's talk about, do boycotts work? And the first issue we have to look at is our political power. We have the ability to create change. We are a powerful nation, and we can never forget that. And our power lies in our influence. For us to not say anything about China's policies, for us to not take a stand, our silence equals acceptance of those bad policies, acceptance of those bad choices, and that is not right. Our boycott, and I will be the first to admit that boycotts of the Olympics in the past haven't worked, but the simple fact of the matter is, even if our boycott doesn't bring about clear change, it sends a clear message, and it says that we are taking a stand for moral reasons alone. We're not worried about pragmatics. We're worried about morality, and we're worried about the moral weight of this decision. We have the opportunity to send a message. We have the opportunity to take a stand, and I would urge all of us to do that, and that's why our boycott will create a difference. There's also the issue with swelling international support. We see many communities in the international community talking about the issue of a boycott. You have the EU passing a resolution asking all their member states to boycott. You have riots in France and Germany and the United States. We need to join these nations in the idea of boycotting. We have an opportunity to act as a follower, to support what the international community is now choosing to look at. And it's even safe to speculate, ladies and gentlemen, that if we decide to boycott, other countries will have the courage to do so as well. We are powerful, and let us not forget that that power has the ability to inspire courage in others. The last issue that I'd like to talk to you about is the issue of legitimacy of the Games. The Olympics are special, and they're a significant honor, and their importance and legitimacy comes because people are in attendance. If nobody decides to attend the 2008 Games in Beijing, they lose a great deal of their legitimacy. Why? Because you have some of the most important and powerful countries in the world not participating, who also by default happen to have some of the best athletes. The Olympics is a source of pride. If no one attends, the honor and pride decreases, and the value of the medals do as well. I would urge us to boycott.
What actions has the UN taken in regards to Sudan and its alleged genocide?
They tried to take a lot of them. Ironically enough, China has blocked many of those actions in the Security Council. The one, I would say, most definite action that they've taken is on that Resolution 1706, which is calling for more peacekeepers to help aid and stability in the region, which China decided not to vote for.
Do you have any idea of the track record and efficacy of UN peacekeepers in areas like Africa in regards to Rwanda?
I would say it'd probably be much easier for peacekeepers to keep the peace if China wasn't giving the Janjaweed guns to shoot them. But that's just my opinion.
But are they effective?
I would say absolutely. When they have the means and necessary materials available to them, they are absolutely effective.
Does the U.S. exercise its veto power as a member of the Security Council when it fulfills their foreign policy issues in protection of its allies and their interests as well?
I would say there's a difference between the United States exercising our interests, which is usually in the moral right, and China voting to stop genocide or not stop genocide.
Is GE talking about boycotting the Olympics or divesting themselves of Chinese and DFAR interests?
GE, the company? Or?
GE is the parent company of NBC.
I would say that no, I would bet that they wouldn't, and that's because of the economic gains that they have from China, and that's why I would say that our boycott has to be for strictly moral reasons, and we have to stand on a ground of morality because those economic ties are so important. Morality is key in today's debate.
Can you give us an example in the U.S. of when the United States has stood on morality only, particularly when they have strong economic ties with a region or a country?
I would say that when we boycotted the Moscow Olympics, we were standing purely on morality, and that we disagreed with the politics of Moscow, and we disagreed so strongly that we felt we needed to take a moral stance, and that was absolutely acceptable. And the LA Summer Games that were held later were the most heavily attended and the only ones to turn a profit because people believed in our boycott that stood on morality.
And yet, Russia was in Afghanistan for another 10 years. Isn't that correct?
And I would say that not saying anything equals silence, and silence equals acceptance. That's why we have to boycott.
The world is full of tragedy and injustice. The promise is not kept by nation states to each other, much less to their own people. The nature of government is really one of disappointment and struggle between individual rights and the common good. In Western society, individual rights trump all, and in the East, the common good is the standard by which all nation states' decisions are based. In failing to understand the underlying issue, the West, particularly those calling for a boycott of the Beijing Olympics, fail in their role to advocate for either the Chinese people or the international community. Resolved, the United States should boycott the 2008 Beijing Summer Olympics, which I am advocating against. I would like to touch on two key issues: the moral imperative of the boycott by trying to gain an understanding of the Chinese position, as well as the reality that boycotts, particularly centered on the Olympics, don't work. In order to understand a little about the moral imperative of this issue, we must understand the parties involved. So let me introduce you to China. China is an ancient civilization going back thousands of years, and it's particularly unique in that it is the one country in all of history where the essential culture and character of the nation remains consistent in its current locality. According to the CIA World Factbook, land mass in China is the size of the United States, though slightly smaller, but its population is almost 4.5 times the United States. It's also utterly racially homogenous, and that 92% of its population is Han Chinese. Michaela brought up the point that they moved Han Chinese into Tibet. In actuality, for the Chinese, that makes total sense, because as they're trying to provide there for their people, they want to expand into the full scope of their nation. Foreign policy in China, its goal is really to protect its people and provide for them. The Great Wall was put out to keep invaders out, and China has suffered foreign occupancies both in the 19th and the 20th century, and in 1949, Mao ended that when his communists took control, sending Chiang Kai-shek and his nationalists to Taiwan. We've only had connection with them in the West since 1972. China's definition of human rights means it's providing and caring for its people. In the China Daily, an English-language Chinese newspaper, Wang Chen, minister of the State Council on Information Office, stated after more than 50 years of economic and social development, the Chinese have leapfrogged from first suffering poverty to being adequately fed and clad, and then to living a well-off life. The CIA World Factbook agrees. Living standards have improved dramatically, and the room for personal choice has expanded. Yet political controls do remain. We also have political controls in our nation. The West, interestingly enough, has no problem at all taking Chinese money. The U.S. Treasury Department says that $486 billion is held by China in U.S. Treasury securities. So what this means is that each one of us in America, 303 million people, owe China $1,600. So it's interesting that we talk about how it's a moral issue, and yet economically we have incredible ties. But the truth of the matter is boycotts don't work. They're not effective, and it takes a very long time, if there's even any hope. All governments under international and typically domestic law have the right to self-determination. We cannot control what the Chinese do any more than we can control what the Iraqis do, or Russia, or Mexico. That's a privilege granted to us with national sovereignty. World leaders are not even united in their call for a boycott. According to The Telegraph, which is a British newspaper, the Prime Minister of England and the exiled leader, the Dalai Lama of Tibet, are not calling for a boycott. Other world leaders in the EU are not calling for a total boycott. Merkel of Germany, Klaus of Czechoslovakia, and Douglas Tusk of Poland, all are only boycotting the opening ceremony. So essentially what they're doing is they're going to a tea party, showing up late. The reality is it's highly ineffective. If you want to talk about a percentage of time, maybe probably even less than 1% of the actual time of the games. Beijing was awarded the games in 2001. And so I'm wondering what happened in those 7 years. Absolutely nothing. We had 7 years to bring these requirements up. If the IOC was so interested in the concerns of the Chinese people in Tibet, they could have put requirements on the Chinese to show that they are improving these relations. The only problem is that the IOC could care less. According to BeijingOlympicsBoycott.com, the Olympics have a reputation for being non-political, but they haven't been anything but. The reality is politics get messed up all the time. The only problem is morality has absolutely nothing to do with it. In 1936, Adolf Hitler decided that he would demonstrate to the world Aryan supremacy. Jesse Owens corrected his notions. In 1968, 2 U.S. athletes from the medal stand did the Black Power salute. They lost their medals. In 1972, 11 Israeli athletes were killed by Black September in Munich because Munich wanted to create a sense of harmony and peace without protecting its athletes. And in 76, 80, and 84, boycotts were called for either against the host countries or because of the political associations of the countries involved in the games. Had absolutely no impact. with USSR and the United States foreign policy. The reality is now, as my husband's in Afghanistan, the government that he and the US have been fighting against for these last 6 years is the government that formed after the Soviets left Afghanistan. Boycotts of any nation don't work. One of the great examples we have in this country is the Selma bus boycotts back in the I believe it was the late 50s, early 60s. Total cold turkey. Absolutely no black person in Selma, Alabama rode the bus. One example from Wikipedia that perhaps could be comparative is the South Africa apartheid boycott. Started in '59 and ended in '94. So boycotts do work if we want to wait decades. Any resolution before the UN will meet a veto by China, Russia, or any of its other allies, because the reality is they have that ability. And as yet, the UN has not decided, and the UN really is the authority in this situation for international politics. The UN hasn't decided to do anything about Darfur. China is not pleased with how we transact our international relations in the US. Could you imagine if they decided to boycott us, our tourism or our services? We would feel humiliated. We would be angry. And this call for a boycott of the Summer Olympics, while perhaps noble, is misguided and ignores the differences in thinking and worldview between the East and West. Boycotts do not work, except perhaps in the long term, and there's no united call for a boycott, even from the Dalai Lama. Resolved, the United States should not boycott the 2008 Beijing Olympics.
So do you feel that the differences between culture that have to do with East and West justify the gross misconduct and behavior of China?
To be honest, my personal feelings are really irrelevant, but the reality is that the Chinese view on human rights is completely different from those in the West. We have issues of our own in terms of human rights. I'm not saying that we have to completely clean up our own house, but the reality is that as America, we have not even decided where we stand on many of these issues. The US, Alaska, we are not divesting ourselves of Darfur. We're not advocating, any of us, sending American troops as part of the UN peacekeeping force into Darfur. The truth of the matter is the slaughter will go on until someone says enough is enough. And it's not going to matter if the boycott happens or not.
So until someone says enough is enough. So you advocate a policy of silence. So you suggest that by this policy of silence, anyone's ever going to say enough is enough?
I wholeheartedly agree that the world could say enough is enough, but its avenue is unfortunately tied up in issues like permanent members of the Security Council being able to veto bills and resolutions that come before them, either in their own interests or in the interests of their friends. We exercise that on a regular basis in terms of our protection of Israel. Russia does the same thing for China and vice versa. Do I wish that the UN had more muscle? Most definitely. But the reality is that China cannot replace the oil that it gets from Darfur, the business that it gets from Darfur, from any other country. They are already in bed with many of what we would, in the West term, despots and tyrannical regimes. I do not think, as much as we would talk about morality, that there's going to be a whole lot of change, simply for the fact that we have the West and the East, their views do not intersect. There is no channel for communication.
Okay, and I think I have time to ask one more question. So are you aware that the IOC did indeed make requirements for China to host the Olympics and that they did not meet any of those requirements and thus were justified in boycotting the Games?
Okay, we're not justified per se in boycotting the Olympics because the IOC failed. The IOC at this point in time could pull the Olympics from China in a heartbeat. They won't. And the reality is that most of the nations of the world look on the futility of the IOC and think, there is no police or enforcement power, and that's the unfortunate thing in all of this. Is if we want change, somebody's got to step up and say enough is enough. No one can, no one will. Thank you.
Jesse Owens may have gone and won a gold medal, but World War II still happened. Why did it happen? Because no one in the international community was willing to stand up and say, enough is enough. I offer you in today's debate that the United States is that player, that we have the courage, the ability to stand up and say, enough is enough, we will not tolerate this, genocide is not acceptable, abuse of your own people is not acceptable, putting down opposition voice is not acceptable. We are strong enough, and don't let anyone else tell you otherwise. I'm going to do a little bit of rebuttal, and then I'm going to go back into talking about the legitimacy of the games and why it's so important. Susan can get up here and talk to you as much as she wants about the differences between East and West, but differences between culture do not justify genocide, they do not justify subjugating the handicapped or the homeless, and they do not justify subjugating and essentially eradicating anyone who disagrees with your view. And that is just the way that it is. I know those cultural differences exist. I'm not going to disagree, but they don't justify the horrible things that China is doing. The fortunate, and I think it's funny that she talks about how China's goal is to protect and to provide. Well, unless you're Tibetan, or you're from Taiwan, or you're handicapped, or you're poor, then it's absolutely acceptable for China to do whatever they want with you and to not provide for you. And I find that to be atrocious and not something we should accept at all. And then she talks about how we're not going to divest in trade, so it doesn't make a difference. It's much more beneficial for us as an American people to stay economically involved in China, because then we have those economic teeth. We have the ability to still be involved, but say, as our trading partner, you do things that are unacceptable and we find morally repugnant, and we're not going to stand for them. We have to take a stand, and if we do, ladies and gentlemen, believe me, others will follow. We have the ability, we have the strength, don't ever doubt it. So let's talk about, once again, just the idea of the legitimacy of the games, because this is very important. I talked to you about how the Olympics is an event that has an incredible amount of significance, and that if countries participate in it, it makes the games honorable, it makes them special, and it provides a truly great forum for athletes to compete. But if you have countries standing together in a unified position and boycotting these games, it delegitimizes the Olympics. It says that nobody even turned out to play because of how morally repugnant you are as a country, and those gold medals that anyone might win at those games are worth less. Ladies and gentlemen, I understand the pragmatics, and I understand that that's a major question in today's debate. But what I am telling you, what I am offering you, is we have to stand on morality here. It's true that when we boycotted the Moscow Olympics, we didn't stop them from slaughtering people in Afghanistan. But what we did say, ladies and gentlemen, is that that's not acceptable. And we as a country have a moral obligation to stand up and say, even if Russia's not willing to listen, we don't accept this. This isn't moral. Your behavior will not be tolerated. And if that's what it takes, if that's what we have to do to create change in the world, then I would absolutely say do not remain silent. Silent is consent, ladies and gentlemen. Silence is saying whatever's happening is fine, because we as the United States, even though we're powerful, aren't going to stand up and say anything. China is going to continue to get bigger. They're going to continue to get powerful. And it's our job as one of the great powers in this world to say enough is enough, and to absolutely stand on moral grounds and boycott the Beijing Olympics.
35 years from the time that the boycott started against the South African apartheid system to from 1959 to 1994. Ravensbrück, Cambodia, Rwanda, Kosovo, Central America in the 90s. Any of these are examples where the United States, as well as the international community, has failed to act morally. A lot of times we were in bed with those that were being attacked. A lot of times we just decided that, you know what, we would look away. China has favored nation status, authorized by Congress. The reality is that morality, though it might be supreme in my own personal heart, has nothing to do with the boycott of the Olympics. If the IOC is concerned enough about Tibet, Darfur, Taiwan, they can pull the games right now. There is absolutely no way. NBC would stand for it. What are they going to air for 2.5 weeks this summer? Truth of the matter is, you know, I'm kind of chuckling thinking reruns, but the reality is that we have had a choice for 7 years as to what we are going to do. How many of you have written your congressmen and senators saying to boycott the Olympics? Oh, I thought he was raising his hand. If our goal is to provide for our people, as the United States is, and I contend that that's China's goal, how are we doing? We have problems, we have things that we're not providing for. We have all known situations where the occupations of countries have not been well received by the natives. We're struggling with that in Afghanistan and Iraq right now. Now, I'm not saying that we're going there and taking over. We're providing political protection and military force. The problem is once you start mixing politics, the military, protection of innocent people, you start running into the whole gamut of things that the United States does not want to deal with. We could go into Darfur right now. We cannot build a consensus. We got nailed to the wall when we went into Iraq without an international census. The rest of the world was okay with Afghanistan because we had 9/11. But the reality is that if we want to do something like DFAR, it has to be almost like a boycott. Everybody has to be involved in it. And so far there is no consensus, even among the European nations that might be talking of boycotting the opening ceremonies. Do I wish that China was better? Yes. Do I wish that they cared for their people, as Michaela says, a little bit better? Yes. Do I wish there were no forced abortions? Yes. Do I wish there were no abortions in America? Yes. But the reality is all of us are governed by this right to govern our nations with national sovereignty. We cannot say, just because someone doesn't understand us or our culture is different, that they're wrong. We can talk to them, we can engage them, but boycotting the Olympics is no engagement, especially when we strip our own citizens of their freedom to choose what they're going to do.
All right, thank you both.